Elijah Mercer, an architect with a fascination for the forgotten, had always been drawn to places with history, abandoned buildings, forgotten mansions, lost memories hidden behind crumbling walls. When he and his wife, Sophia, stumbled upon Blackthorn Mansion, they thought they had found the perfect project. Isolated deep in the woods, the mansion stood as a relic of a time long past. It was decaying, its grandeur buried beneath years of neglect, but Elijah saw potential. For him, this was more than just a restoration. It was a resurrection. But from the moment they stepped inside, something felt off. The air was too still, the silence too loud. Every step echoed, not with the sound of their footsteps, but with something older, something sinister, as if the mansion itself was watching and waiting. As they explored the house, their excitement quickly turned to unease. The grand hall, once magnificent, was now cloaked in shadows, the chandeliers above swaying gently despite the absence of wind. Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. It started small, just a faint whisper in the distance, too soft to catch. But then, the whispers grew louder, clearer. A voice, soft and feminine, seemed to call his name. At first, he dismissed it as his imagination. After all, they were miles away from anyone. There was no one else in the house. Or was there? Elijah's heartbeat quickened, a cold sweat forming on his brow. He glanced at Sophia, who seemed unfazed, her eyes focused on the architecture. "Did you hear that?" he asked. She shook her head, but her expression told him something was off. And then, as they stood in the center of the room, it happened. A deep, guttural whisper filled the air, so loud it felt like the walls themselves were speaking. "Get out." The words were unmistakable, yet Elijah couldn't tell where they were coming from. His blood ran cold. The voice wasn't angry. No, it was something far worse. It was terrified. Whatever had spoken those words was afraid, and that fear seeped into Elijah, rooting him in place. Before they could even react, the echoing voice vanished, leaving behind an oppressive silence that pressed down on their chests like a weight. But what haunted Elijah most was the realization that the voice wasn't trying to scare them away. It was warning them. Before we dive deeper into the mysteries of Blackthorn Mansion, don't forget to hit subscribe and like this video. Trust me, you're going to want to stay with us as we uncover the terrifying history of this place. But beware, once you hear the voices, they never stop. It all began the night Elijah first dreamed of Blackthorn Mansion. In the dream, the house was as it must have been in its prime, alive, vibrant, filled with light and the soft hum of conversations that echoed through its vast halls. Elijah could smell the faint scent of lavender and candle wax, the air thick with the warmth of a long-forgotten summer evening. But something was wrong. The longer he wandered through the rooms, the more unsettling it became. The laughter he heard seemed too distant, too hollow, as though it wasn't joy that filled the house, but something darker. Each step felt heavy, like the floor was shifting under him, almost as if the house was sinking into the ground. And then came the voices again, whispers that swirled around him, low and indistinct, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. He tried to focus to make out what they were saying, but they were just out of reach, teasing his mind. Elijah found himself standing in front of a large mirror, its surface covered in dust and grime. As he reached out to wipe it clean, his reflection stared back at him. But it wasn't quite right. His face, though familiar, was distorted, his eyes dark and sunken, his skin pale. There was a heaviness in his expression, a look of dread that he couldn't explain. He turned away, feeling a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. The whispers grew louder now, urgent, like a warning he couldn't quite decipher. The house around him began to shift, the walls bending and twisting, shadows creeping out from the corners, growing darker and more menacing with every passing second. And then, without warning, the ground beneath him gave way. He felt himself falling, plummeting into darkness as the world around him dissolved. The air grew colder, sharp, like the bite of frost on bare skin. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His body tumbled through the black void, and just as the terror threatened to overwhelm him, he hit the floor with a bone-shaking thud. Gasping for breath, Elijah opened his eyes. He was back in the grand hall of the mansion, but everything was different now. The chandeliers hung like skeletons from the ceiling, their crystal shattered, and the walls wept with dark streaks of moisture. And the voices, they were no longer whispers. They were screaming. Elijah's pulse raced as he glanced around, trying to find the source of the noise. His eyes landed on a door he hadn't noticed before, a massive, ancient thing, its wood rotting and splintered. The screaming seemed to come from behind it, desperate, anguished. He stepped toward it, his heart pounding in his ears, the sound of the cries tearing at his sanity. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to turn back, but something stronger, a twisted curiosity, perhaps, drove him forward. As his hand wrapped around the cold iron handle, the door slowly creaked open. The scream stopped, dead silence. Elijah stepped inside, the cold air swallowing him whole. In the darkness beyond, he saw them, figures standing motionless, shrouded in shadows. They were barely human, more like silhouettes frozen in time. And then, from the depths of the room, one of the figures moved. A woman, her face obscured, stepped forward, her movements slow, deliberate. Her voice, a raspy whisper, echoed in the cold air. "You shouldn't have come." Elijah awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, his heart hammering in his chest. The room around him was quiet, the soft glow of morning filtering through the cracked windows. But the dream clung to him, suffocating, too real to shake. And then, as he lay there, trying to convince himself it had only been a nightmare, he heard it again, the soft, unmistakable whisper from the dream. Only this time, it wasn't in his head. It was coming from the hallway, outside his room. If you're ready to uncover more about the horrors hidden within Blackthorn Mansion, hit the subscribe button and like the video. But be warned, once the echoes start, they never stop. The next few days were a blur of unease and tension. Elijah and Sophia had settled into Blackthorn Mansion, but it felt less like a home and more like a trap. The air inside the mansion seemed colder, heavier, as if it was thick with something unseen, something waiting. The echoes from Elijah's dreams bled into reality, making it impossible to tell where the nightmares ended and the waking terror began. Every corner of the house seemed to hide a secret, every room holding its breath, waiting to reveal something dreadful. At night, the silence was unbearable, not peaceful but oppressive, filled with the weight of things unsaid and unseen. It was during one of those nights that the first undeniable disturbance occurred. Elijah was alone in the study, reviewing blueprints, when a sound, faint but unmistakable, broke the silence. A slow, deliberate creaking of floorboards, like footsteps, echoed through the corridor just outside the room. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The house was old, but this sound wasn't the settling of an ancient structure. It was someone or something moving with purpose. Elijah strained to listen, the sound growing closer. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. He held his breath, waiting for the knock, but none came. Slowly, the handle turned. The door creaked open an inch, but the hallway beyond was empty, drenched in shadows. He stepped into the corridor, a shiver running down his spine as a cold draft swept through the air. There in the distance was a soft, persistent sound, a whisper. It was the same voice from his dreams, now echoing through the mansion's cold walls. The voice, though indistinct, carried a chilling familiarity, as though it knew Elijah, knew every part of him. It whispered his name, beckoning him deeper into the mansion. Every step he took felt heavier, as if the house was trying to pull him down, deeper into its history, its madness. The wooden floor beneath him groaned in protest, and the shadows seemed to stretch and grow, twisting into grotesque shapes that clung to the walls. As he moved toward the source of the whispering, the house shifted. The walls felt closer, the ceiling lower, as though the mansion itself was alive, reacting to his presence. He could smell it now. Something foul, like damp earth mixed with decay. The scent grew stronger the deeper he ventured, and the whispers became more frantic, almost pleading. He rounded a corner and stopped dead in his tracks. Before him, carved into the very walls, were names, hundreds of them, scratched deep into the stone, as if by desperate hands. Some were old, barely legible, others fresh, with the dust of crumbled rocks still clinging to them. Elijah ran his hand over one name, his fingers tracing the letters. It was unfamiliar, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen it before, in a dream, perhaps, or a memory that wasn't his own. Suddenly, a violent gust of wind slammed the door at the end of the hallway shut, the sound reverberating through the mansion. Elijah jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. The whispers stopped. Everything was still, unnervingly still. The temperature in the corridor dropped so suddenly that his breath came out in visible puffs. And then, in the eerie silence, something scraped against the walls, a slow, dragging sound, like nails raking over stone. The sound made his skin crawl. It was coming from the other side of the door. He approached, each step weighed down by a growing sense of dread. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle, unsure if he was ready to face whatever was waiting for him on the other side. We opened the door. The room beyond was dark, the air so cold it felt like stepping into a tomb. And there, in the center of the room, was a figure, a woman, her back to him, standing motionless. Her long, dark hair hung limp, her head slightly bowed, as if she was listening to something only she could hear. Elijah's heart pounded in his ears, his body frozen in place. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, as still as a statue, her presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of despair. He wanted to turn back, to run, but something kept him there, rooted to the spot. Then, slowly, the woman began to turn. Elijah's breath caught in his throat as her face came into view. Not just her face, but a face he had seen before. She was the woman from his dreams, her eyes hollow, dark pits of nothingness. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, only the distant, faint echo of that same whisper. And then, with a suddenness that jolted him to his core, she lunged forward, her hands outstretched, her mouth wide open in a silent scream. The air around him warped, bending reality itself, and Elijah stumbled back, his vision blurring as the house seemed to collapse in on itself. When he came to, he was back in the study, the blueprints scattered across the floor, the door firmly shut. The house was quiet again, too quiet, but the sense of wrongness lingered, clinging to the very air he breathed. Whatever had happened in that hallway, it wasn't over. The mansion had shown him just a glimpse of the horrors it held, and Elijah knew, deep down, that the worst was yet to come. If you're intrigued by the mysteries that lie within Blackthorn Mansion, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. But be warned, once you enter, you may never leave. The night of the most terrifying dream came without warning. Elijah had been struggling to sleep for days, haunted by the ever-growing presence of the mansion. It was as if the house had crept into his mind, slowly taking root, twisting his thoughts, and feeding off his fear. When he finally drifted into a restless sleep, the dream came swiftly, so vivid, so real that waking from it seemed impossible. In the dream, Elijah found himself standing once more in the grand hall of Blackthorn Mansion, but this time, everything was wrong. The walls, once lined with portraits of forgotten owners, were cracked and oozing a thick, dark liquid. The air was heavy with the stench of rotting wood and mildew, so thick he could taste it. Above him, the chandeliers flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. The house groaned, as if it were alive, in pain, suffering. Elijah took a step forward, his boots sinking slightly into the floor, which now felt soft, like wet earth. The whispers returned, louder than ever, a chorus of voices overlapping in agonized cries. They weren't calling his name anymore. They were screaming it, demanding his attention, pulling him deeper into the house. As he moved through the hall, the walls seemed to close in around him, narrowing, bending, trapping him. His heart raced, and his breath came in short gasps, every instinct screaming for him to turn back. But something drove him forward, a pull he couldn't resist. He found himself standing before the same door from his earlier dream, the ancient, rotting wood and iron handle coated in grime. The door seemed to pulse, as if something on the other side was alive, waiting for him. His hand moved against his will, grasping the handle, and as the door swung open, the temperature plummeted. The room beyond was pitch black, an oppressive darkness that swallowed all light. But he could feel them, figures and shadows, watching him, waiting. Suddenly, the darkness parted, and at the far end of the room, he saw her again, the woman from his previous dreams. This time, her face was fully visible. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her eyes sunken and hollow, her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. She stood motionless, her arms outstretched, as if offering herself to the darkness. And then, slowly, she began to speak, her voice a raspy, broken whisper. "They are coming!" The floor beneath Elijah's feet began to tremble, and with a sickening lurch, it split open, revealing a chasm of darkness that seemed to go on forever. The air grew colder still, and from the pit came a deep, guttural noise, like the groaning of the earth itself. Elijah tried to step back, but his feet were rooted to the spot, his body frozen in place. The woman moved closer, her eyes locking onto his with a cold, dead stare. Her voice grew louder, more insistent. "They are here." In an instant, the room erupted into chaos. The walls of the mansion twisted violently, the wood splintering and cracking as unseen forces tore the house apart. The chandeliers crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces, and the ground beneath Elijah's feet began to crumble. He could feel it now, the presence of something immense, something ancient and terrible, rising from the pit below. The darkness swirled around him, thick and suffocating, and in the midst of it all, he heard the sound of 1,000 voices screaming in unison. It was as if the entire history of Blackthorn Mansion, every tragedy, every death, every moment of suffering, was crashing down on him at once. In a sudden, violent movement, the woman lunged toward him, her hands outstretched, her face twisted in a mask of rage and sorrow. Elijah tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her fingers brushed against his skin, and in that moment, everything went black. Elijah awoke with a violent start, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He was back in bed, drenched in sweat, but something was wrong. The room was quiet, too quiet. He glanced over at Sophia, expecting to see her peacefully sleeping beside him, but the bed was empty. Panic surged through him. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, that for a moment, he questioned if he had truly woken up. He sat up, his eyes scanning the room, and then he saw it, the unmistakable sign that the dream had followed him into the waking world. On the floor by the bed, in the exact spot where the woman had stood in his dream, was a single, wet footprint, dark, muddy, and impossibly real. Elijah's blood ran cold. The echoes weren't just in his dreams anymore. They were here. They had crossed over. Terrified, he bolted from the bed, calling out for Sophia, but the house was silent. No response. The footprint remained, a chilling reminder that whatever had been waiting in the mansion was now closer than ever. If you're eager to uncover the truth behind the echoes of Blackthorn Mansion, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. But be careful. Sometimes, the things that follow you out of your nightmares are more real than you can imagine. Elijah stood frozen in place, his eyes locked on the muddy footprint that shouldn't be there. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of it. How could something from his dream have crossed into reality? His breath came in shallow gasps, and he wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. The silence of Blackthorn Mansion was oppressive, almost mocking, as if the house was watching, waiting for him to make his next move. He hurried down the hallway, calling out for Sophia, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. But no one answered. She was gone. As he searched frantically through the mansion, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on him, the air thickening with an unseen presence. The echo of his own footsteps sounded wrong, almost as if they were being mimicked, as though something, or someone, was walking just behind him, invisible but there. The whispers from the night before lingered in his mind, scratching at his sanity. They are here. The words sent a chill down his spine, a reminder that the dream had been more than a nightmare. It had been a warning. He stumbled upon Sophia's phone, discarded in the kitchen as if she had left in a hurry. There were no signs of a struggle, no messages, no calls. It was as if she had simply vanished. But the further he delved into the house's labyrinth of rooms, the more he realized she wasn't the only one who had disappeared. Pictures of them that had once lined the hallways, photos from their recent move, their life before the mansion, were gone. In their place were old, faded portraits of people he didn't recognize, faces twisted in expressions of sorrow and despair. These were the faces of Blackthorn Mansion's past victims, souls trapped in time. The realization hit him hard. The mansion was erasing them, piece by piece. Desperate for answers, Elijah returned to the library, where he had earlier found fragments of the mansion's history. There, buried beneath layers of dust and decay, was a journal, old, leather-bound, and stained with age. The name on the cover was almost illegible, but inside, the words were clear. It was the journal of a man who had lived in Blackthorn Mansion over a century ago, a man who had, like Elijah, heard the whispers and witnessed the impossible. His entries grew more erratic, more frantic, detailing the voices that haunted him, the nightmares that began to blend with reality, until one day his entries simply stopped. The last sentence was chilling. Asterisk, the house is alive and it wants me. Elijah's hands trembled as he turned the pages. The journal confirmed his darkest fear. He wasn't the first to experience this. There had been others, countless others, each drawn to the mansion, each hearing the same whispers, each slowly erased from the world. But it was the discovery in the final pages that made his blood run cold. It wasn't just the house that was trapping them. It was something far older, something malevolent, feeding off the souls of those who entered, bending time and reality to its will. And now, it had Sophia. Determined not to let the house claim them both, Elijah followed the clues in the journal to a hidden room beneath the mansion, a room that the previous victims had spoken of in hushed tones, referred to only as the Echo Chamber. It was said to be the heart of the mansion's curse, where time and space distorted, and the boundaries between the living and the dead dissolved. Armed with only a flashlight and the journal, Elijah made his way down a narrow, spiraling staircase, the walls closing in around him. The further he descended, the colder it became, the air thick with the stench of rot. His breath fogged in the beam of the flashlight, and the sound of distant whispers filled the darkness, growing louder with every step. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a door, massive, ancient, its wood blackened with age. His hand hovered over the handle, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed in on him from all sides. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. Inside, the room was nothing like he had imagined. It was vast, impossibly vast, stretching out in all directions, yet the walls seemed to shift and warp, as if the space itself was alive. In the center of the room stood an old, cracked mirror, its surface smeared with dirt and grime. But what caught Elijah's attention was the figure reflected in the glass. Sophia, standing motionless, her eyes wide with terror. She wasn't alone. Behind her were countless others, men, women, children, all staring blankly into the void, their faces gaunt, their skin pale. They were the echoes of Blackthorn Mansion, trapped in the mirror's reflection, lost in time. Elijah rushed toward her, but no matter how close he got, the distance between them never seemed to close. His footsteps echoed endlessly in the chamber, and the walls seemed to ripple and pulse, as if the mansion itself was laughing at his desperation. He could see Sophia's lips moving, but no sound came out. She was trying to tell him something, her eyes pleading with him to listen, but the mirror's surface rippled like water, distorting her words. Then, in a sudden flash of clarity, Elijah understood. The house wasn't just feeding off their fear. It was trapping them in a loop, forcing them to relive their worst moments, their despair, over and over again. The whispers, the voices, the screams, they weren't warnings. They were the cries of those who had been claimed by the mansion, begging for release. And now, it was his turn. As the weight of this realization settled in, the mirror began to crack. Small fissures spread across the glass, distorting Sophia's face, and Elijah could feel the mansion tightening its grip around him. Time was running out. He had to make a choice: stay and fight the house's curse, risking his soul, or flee and leave Sophia and the others trapped forever. What would you do? If you're as haunted by the mysteries of Blackthorn Mansion as Elijah is, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. The echoes are getting louder, and we've only scratched the surface of the horror that lies within. Elijah felt the weight of the decision pulling him into despair. The discovery of the echo chamber and the horrifying reality of the mirror left him shaken. But what chilled him to his core was the realization that Sophia was now trapped in the same twisted web of time and terror. She was unreachable, her face fading in and out of the shattered reflection, and Elijah's mind reeled with questions. How had this happened? What was this ancient evil lurking in Blackthorn Mansion, and how had it claimed so many lives without anyone knowing? Desperate for answers, Elijah turned to the one person he had been avoiding, the town's local historian, Eleanor Croft. She had warned them not to move into Blackthorn Mansion, her voice thick with fear and sorrow when she had spoken of the mansion's past. He had ignored her at the time, dismissing her as just another superstitious old woman clinging to ghost stories. But now he realized that she might be the only one who could help him understand the true nature of the house. When he arrived at her home, Eleanor seemed to be expecting him. Her small, cluttered cottage was filled with books and artifacts, relics of a time long past. Her face, weathered and lined with age, held a grim expression as she let him inside. "I told you," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you the house was alive." Eleanor led Elijah to a dusty room filled with old documents and maps. On the table, laid out like a blueprint of despair, were records of Blackthorn Mansion, its construction, its many owners, and most disturbingly, its tragic history. Every family that had lived there had vanished or met untimely, gruesome ends. Eleanor explained that the mansion was built on cursed ground, a place where reality itself seemed to warp. Centuries ago, a ritual had been performed there by the mansion's original owner, a man named Alistair Blackthorn, who sought to escape death by binding his soul to the house. But something had gone terribly wrong. Instead of immortality, Blackthorn had unleashed a force beyond comprehension, a force that twisted time and space within the walls of the mansion, trapping the souls of those who entered. Elijah listened in growing horror as Eleanor described how the mansion had become a living entity, feeding on fear and despair. The echoes of the past were not just memories. They were the trapped souls of those who had lived and died within its cursed halls. Each scream, each whisper was a fragment of a life stolen by the house, their pain replayed over and over in an endless cycle of torment. And now, Sophia had become part of that cycle. Despair gnawed at Elijah as Eleanor revealed the truth. There was no known way to break the curse. The house consumed those who entered, erasing them from existence, trapping them in a loop of suffering that stretched across time. But there was one hope, she said, a faint glimmer in the darkness. The Key of Shadows, an ancient artifact hidden deep within the mansion's foundations. According to legend, the key had the power to sever the house's connection to the souls it trapped. But no one who had ever gone in search of the key had returned. Elijah knew what he had to do, but the weight of it crushed him. The mansion wasn't just a building. It was a predator, ancient and malevolent, and he was walking directly into its jaws. The thought of leaving Sophia trapped, lost to the echoes of the past, was unbearable. But the prospect of facing the mansion's darkest secret, of walking deeper into the house's heart of darkness, filled him with dread. The air around him seemed colder, as if the house could feel his resolve and was already tightening its grip. As he made his way back to the mansion, the forest around him seemed to close in, the trees looming tall and twisted like silent sentinels. The wind whispered through the branches, and for a moment, Elijah thought he heard the voices again, soft, distant, and filled with sorrow. They were calling him, pulling him back to the place where reality had already begun to unravel. The mansion stood before him, its dark silhouette against the moonlit sky, looking more like a fortress of nightmares than a home. Every window seemed like a darkened eye, watching him, waiting. As Elijah stepped inside, the air grew thick, and the door slammed shut behind him with a force that reverberated through the house. The mansion was alive, and it was ready for him. The room seemed different now, more twisted and distorted. Time moved strangely here. Hours passed in minutes, or perhaps it was minutes that felt like days. He no longer recognized the hallways. They twisted in ways that defied logic, leading him deeper into the mansion's labyrinthine structure. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing with an unseen rhythm. Shadows darted just out of sight, and the air was filled with a low hum, almost like the distant murmur of 1,000 voices speaking in unison. Then came the whispers again. This time, they were louder, more insistent, and they spoke his name over and over, echoing through the corridors. He could feel the presence of those who had come before him, their despair clinging to the walls like a thick fog. Every step took him closer to the heart of the mansion, to the place where reality bent and nightmares bled into the waking world. As he approached the mansion's ancient foundations, he felt a presence behind him, cold and malevolent. He turned, expecting to see one of the shadows that had haunted him for days, but instead, he saw Sophia. She stood at the end of the hall, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She didn't speak, but her expression was one of silent terror. Elijah's heart ached as he took a step toward her, but as he did, the floor beneath him gave way, plunging him into darkness. He landed in a vast, empty chamber, the air so cold it burned his lungs. At the center of the room stood a single pedestal, and upon it, the key of shadows, black, twisted, and pulsing with an eerie light. But the key wasn't unguarded. The shadows began to move, swirling around him, taking shape, becoming the lost souls of Blackthorn Mansion. They surrounded him, their faces twisted in agony, their whispers louder now, overwhelming, drowning him in their despair. Elijah reached for the key, but a cold, skeletal hand grasped his wrist. He turned to see the face of Alistair Blackthorn, twisted by centuries of torment, his hollow eyes staring into Elijah's soul. "You can't save her," Blackthorn rasped, his voice a whisper of darkness. "This house is mine. They are all mine." In that moment, Elijah realized the terrible truth. The house wasn't just cursed, it was a prison for Blackthorn's soul, and would claim anyone who tried to break free. The weight of the realization pressed down on him, and for the first time, Elijah felt truly helpless. As the shadows closed in, he had to make a choice: fight for the key and risk being consumed by the mansion, or flee, leaving Sophia to her fate. The cold grip of Alistair Blackthorn tightened around Elijah's wrist, his skeletal fingers like iron shackles, pulling him deeper into the void. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest, his breath quickening as he stared into Blackthorn's hollow, empty eyes. He could feel the malevolence radiating from him, a centuries-old darkness that had been feeding on the souls of the lost. The room around them felt alive, the shadows writhing like serpents, closing in from every direction, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. Elijah's pulse quickened as he realized there was no escape. He had come too far, ventured too deep into Blackthorn Mansion. In the center of the room, the key of shadows still pulsed with an eerie light, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the stone walls. It was the only thing that could sever the mansion's curse, but now it felt impossibly distant, guarded by the twisted soul of the man who had created this nightmare. Elijah knew that reaching it would be his only hope of saving Sophia and escaping the mansion's grip, but the weight of Blackthorn's presence made every movement feel like wading through thick, icy water. Blackthorn's voice rasped like the scraping of stone on stone, low and hollow. Asterisk. You cannot take what belongs to me. This house, these souls, they are mine. And now, so are you. Asterisk. His mouth curled into a twisted, grotesque grin, his eyes burning with centuries of madness. The room felt like it was shrinking, the shadows pressing in from all sides, suffocating Elijah with their darkness. He could hear the voices of the others, the echoes of those who had come before him, screaming in unison, begging for release, but trapped in an endless loop of torment. Elijah pulled his arm free from Blackthorn's grip, stumbling backward, his eyes darting to the key. The room seemed to warp and twist around him, the walls bending as if the house itself was trying to swallow him whole. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the mansion's curse pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe. He could feel the cold, malevolent presence of the souls trapped within the house, watching him, waiting for him to make a move. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance. Asterisk, asterisk, Sophia, asterisk, asterisk. She stood at the edge of the room, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes locked on Elijah. But something was wrong. Her eyes were empty, hollow, like Blackthorn's. She took a step toward him, her movements slow, mechanical, as if she was being controlled by an unseen force. Elijah's heart clenched in his chest. This wasn't the Sophia he knew. The house had taken her, twisted her, made her a part of its dark, endless cycle. Sophia, Elijah whispered, his voice cracking with fear and sorrow. She didn't respond, her empty eyes staring through him, as if she didn't even recognize him. The whispers of the mansion grew louder, more insistent, as if the house was reveling in his despair, feeding off his fear. Blackthorn stepped forward, his twisted grin widening. She is mine now, just like all the others, he hissed, his voice dripping with malice. Asterisk. You cannot save her. You cannot save yourself. Elijah's mind raced. He was running out of time. The mansion was closing in, the shadows tightening their grip around him, and Sophia was slipping further away, lost to the darkness that had consumed so many before her. He had to act. He had to reach the key. But as he moved toward it, the shadows surged forward, forming a solid wall between him and his only hope. Elijah's breath came in ragged gasps as the darkness wrapped around him, cold and suffocating. And then, in a moment of sheer desperation, Elijah remembered the journal, the one left behind by those who had come before him. It had mentioned something about breaking the mansion's hold, about confronting the source of its power. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the journal, his hands trembling as he flipped through the brittle pages. There it was, written in faded ink. Asterisk. The key alone is not enough. The mansion must face its own reflection. Asterisk. The words echoed in his mind as he glanced at the cracked mirror in the corner of the room, the same mirror where he had first seen the echoes of the souls trapped within mansion. It was a symbol of the house's control, the place where time and reality warped. Elijah's eyes flicked from the mirror to the key, and then to Blackthorn, who loomed closer, his twisted figure casting a shadow that seemed to consume the entire room. Elijah knew what he had to do. The mirror, the key. It was all connected. The house's curse, Blackthorn's soul, the trapped echoes. It all centered around that mirror, a gateway between worlds, between time and space. But getting to it meant facing Blackthorn head-on. With a surge of adrenaline, Elijah bolted toward the mirror. Blackthorn lunged after him, his skeletal fingers reaching out to drag him back into the darkness. But Elijah was faster. He grabbed the key of shadows, the cold metal burning against his skin, and in one swift motion, he slammed it into the mirror's surface. The mirror shattered with a deafening crack, shards of glass exploding outward, filling the room with blinding light. The force of the explosion knocked Blackthorn backward, his figure writhing in agony as the mirror's light reflected back on him. The shadows recoiled, shrieking in pain, as if the very foundation of the mansion was being torn apart. The ground trembled, the walls groaning, as the house itself began to unravel. For a moment, Elijah thought it was over, that he had won. But then, from the center of the broken mirror, something dark and terrible began to emerge. A shape, formless and vast, a void that sucked in the light around it. It was the true heart of Blackthorn Mansion, the ancient evil that had bound itself to the house centuries ago, the thing that had twisted Blackthorn's soul and claimed so many others. And now, it was free. Elijah stood frozen, the dark presence towering over him, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. He could feel its hatred, its hunger, as it reached out toward him. But before it could take him, there was a scream. Sophia's scream, piercing through the darkness. The light from the shattered mirror intensified, and the dark shape recoiled, its form flickering and weakening. Elijah's heart pounded as he realized what was happening. The curse was breaking. The souls trapped within the mansion were fighting back. The echoes, the lost voices, they weren't just victims anymore. They were fighting for their freedom. The mansion groaned one final time, its walls cracking and crumbling, and then silence. When Elijah opened his eyes, he was standing in the ruins of Blackthorn Mansion, the twisted shadows gone, the air still and quiet. Sophia lay unconscious at his feet, but alive. The mirror was shattered, and the key of shadows lay beside it, its power spent. Elijah knelt beside her, his heart heavy with relief and sorrow. They had survived, but the cost had been great. The mansion was gone, its curse broken, but the echoes of its past still lingered in the air. The darkness had been vanquished, but its memory would remain. As he carried Sophia away from the ruins, Elijah knew that they would never be free of Blackthorn Mansion. Its shadow would follow them, haunting their dreams, reminding them of the terror they had faced. And though the mansion was gone, its echoes would live on, waiting for the next soul to hear their call. As the dust settled and the shattered remnants of Blackthorn Mansion lay silent, Elijah stood at the edge of the ruins, watching the early morning fog roll in, shrouding what remained of the cursed estate. The once imposing structure was reduced to rubble, yet something in the air felt unfinished, unresolved. Elijah had saved Sophia, broken the mirror, and severed the mansion's hold on them. But deep down, he knew the darkness had not been truly defeated. The mansion had been destroyed, but its presence lingered, like an unseen predator lurking just beyond sight. Sophia, still weak but conscious, clung to Elijah as they moved away from the wreckage. Her eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, reflected the same unease that gnawed at Elijah's heart. She whispered his name, her voice trembling. Elijah, do you feel it? It's not over, is it? He didn't answer her, but he knew she was right. There was something unnatural about the silence that surrounded them, as though the mansion's essence had not been destroyed, but had simply changed. As they reached the safety of their car, the air around them seemed to shift. Elijah glanced back toward the ruins one last time and froze. Among the rubble, something caught his eye. A glimmer of light, barely visible through the mist. It flickered for a moment, and then it was gone. His heart raced. Could be just his imagination. Or was it something more? Something waiting, watching from shadows of the past? The broken mirror, the shattered key. They were supposed to be the end, but in that fleeting moment, Elijah realized with chilling certainty that Blackthorn Mansion was not done with them. He turned away, forcing himself to breathe, trying to shake the feeling that had settled deep in his bones. They drove away in silence, the road twisting and turning through the dark forest, but the further they got from Mansion, the stronger the pull in his mind became. The whispers, they had returned, faint at first, just a distant hum, but growing louder, more insistent. They were different now, more coherent. The same voices that had haunted him in the mansion were following them, like shadows clinging to the edge of his consciousness. Sophia suddenly gripped his arm, her face pale. Did you hear that? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Elijah's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He didn't want to admit it, but yes, he heard it too. The voices weren't gone. They had followed them. The echoes were still with them, whispering from the corners of their minds, telling stories of those still trapped, of lives still lost to the mansion's hunger. As the car sped through the fog, the landscape outside began to blur, twisting and warping like it had inside the mansion. Time felt distorted, stretching unnaturally. Elijah glanced at the clock on the dashboard. The hands were spinning wildly, the numbers shifting and rearranging themselves in ways that defied logic. His heart pounded in his chest, his breathing quickening. They weren't out. They hadn't escaped. The mansion's grasp extended far beyond its physical walls. Panic gripped him as they approached a small, forgotten town on the edge of the forest. The town wasn't supposed to be there. It hadn't been on any map. The streets were eerily quiet, lined with decaying buildings, their windows shattered, their doors hanging loosely from their hinges. Elijah slowed the car, his mind racing. Something about the place felt familiar, too familiar. His blood ran cold as the realization hit him. This was a reflection, another layer of Blackthorn Mansion's curse. It was as if the house had seeped into reality itself, distorting it, twisting it into something unrecognizable. Sophia's grip tightened on his arm, her breath shallow. Asterisk, we can't escape it, can we? Asterisk, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elijah didn't have an answer. The mansion had become part of them, its echoes entwined with their very souls. The truth was undeniable. Asterisk, asterisk, Blackthorn Mansion, asterisk, asterisk, wasn't just a place. It was a force, a malignant presence that would haunt them no matter how far they ran. Suddenly, the car's radio crackled to life, filling the silence with static, and then the whispers. Clearer than ever before, they filled the car, voices overlapping, each one speaking a different story, a different plea for help. Elijah's hands shook as he reached for the dial, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't turn off. The voices grew louder, more desperate, as if the souls of the mansion were crying out for release, for recognition. And then, one voice cut through the rest, sharp and unmistakable. Asterisk, you'll be back. Elijah's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop on the deserted road. For a long moment, the world seemed to stand still. The static on the radio faded, the whispers growing distant once more, leaving only the sound of their heavy breathing. The road stretched out before them, empty, but the fog pressed in from all sides, as if waiting to consume them. They sat in silence for what felt like hours, neither daring to speak, neither daring to acknowledge what they both knew deep down. Blackthorn Mansion had marked them. They could run, they could try to escape, but the mansion's shadow would always loom over them, its whispers following them wherever they went. The curse wasn't broken. It had simply changed shape, adapted, and now it was more dangerous than ever. As they drove off again, the fog seemed to close in behind them, swallowing the road they had just traveled. Elijah glanced in the rearview mirror, and for just a moment, he thought he saw something, another figure standing in the fog, watching them leave. But when he blinked, it was gone, leaving only the faint sound of a whisper on the wind. The story of Blackthorn Mansion was far from over. The house, the echoes, the curse, they still had more to tell. And Elijah knew, deep down, that one day they would be forced to return. The mansion wouldn't let them go so easily. What do you think? Is Blackthorn Mansion truly gone? Or is this just the beginning? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know if you believe in the power of echoes that never fade. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button if you want more stories of dark places where the past refuses to stay buried. Because some stories never really end.